famous for talking about the nuances and putting footnotes, and so we put some footnotes in there to refine some of our principles. But basically we're saying whatever the Supreme Court has said about what the First Amendment allows is what you should allow. And whatever the First Amendment so far, as interpreted by the Supreme Court, says you can prohibit, then you should be able to prohibit. And so we've nuanced that, we've outlined more detail about that in our charter, but that's our basic proposition. And that is going to be the proposition, one of several that we're going to be talking about today with our panel. Christian communicators, and that's who we represent. We represent not just Christian broadcasters, many of them, but also Christian communicators of a wide variety and stripe. Believe that the message we carry about Jesus Christ and his redemptive plan is important because it changes lives and it impacts eternity. So that's why we are so vigorous in insisting on a level playing field, a free marketplace of ideas. As John Milton said, good ideas are going to rise, bad ideas will fall. Let's create that marketplace that we can believe in. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. I'm going to invite our distinguished panel to please come up here. And as they are, I'm going to give a brief introduction of each one and then hand it back to Craig for the panel. I wanted to mention, if you do not have one of the press packets that has the actual charter in it that we're talking about, they're actually on the table over there, or we're happy to get you one if you wanted to signal to one of our staff people. So, great. Is someone? Well, thank you to our panelists for being here. We very much appreciate their time and their participation. Craig is going to lead this panel, but let me just quickly introduce the folks who are up here. Immediately to my left here is Stephen Waldman. He's an author, a journalist, and an entrepreneur. He's currently visiting senior media policy scholar at the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. And from 2010 to 2011, he was senior advisor to the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, where he was the lead author of the landmark report, The Information Needs of Communities, the Changing Media Landscape in a Broadband Age. The report was called by NPR's On the Media one of the most comprehensive overviews of the U.S. media ever produced. Prior to leading the FCC effort, Waldman was a successful internet pioneer. In 1999, he co-founded BeliefNet.com, which was longtime the largest website on spirituality. He's also served as national editor of U.S. News and World Report, national correspondent for Newsweek, the editor of the Washington Monthly, and Steve's work has appeared in a wide variety of publications, including the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Christianity Today, the Huffington Post, and many others. He's also author of the national bestseller, Founding Faith, Providence, Politics, and the Birth of Religious Freedom in America, and he lives with his family in Brooklyn. So thanks, Steve, for being here. And to Steve's left is Colby May. Colby May is the senior counsel and director of the Washington office of the American Center for Law and Justice. He's been with ACLJ since 1994, and he specializes in federal litigation, regulatory proceedings, communications and technology, nonprofit tax issues, and First Amendment law. Colby graduated from George Mason University School of Law and has participated in a number of cases, more than I can even mention, but including Turner Broadcasting Systems versus the FCC in 1994, McConnell versus the FEC in 2003, AOC versus Planned Parenthood, and a number of other important cases. Colby's a member of the District of Columbia Bar and the Virginia State Bar, and he practiced before the Supreme Court, a number of courts of appeals, as well as the Supreme Court of Virginia. Colby has provided testimony before Congress on a number of religious liberty issues, and he's also an adjunct professor at Regent University in Virginia Beach. So thank you, Colby, for being here. Adam Fearn is to his left. Adam Fearn is a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center for George Mason University with a technology policy program. His primary research interests are technology, media, internet, and free speech policy issues, with a particular focus on online child safety and digital privacy policy issues. Fearn has spent almost 2 decades in the public policy research community. He previously served as president of the Progress and Freedom Foundation, director of the Telecommunications Studies at the Cato Institute, senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation, and researcher at the Adam Smith Institute in London. He's author or editor of a number of books on media regulation and child safety issues, as well as the role of federalism in high technology markets, and has also served on quite a number of online safety task forces, and has received the Family Online Safety Institute Award for Outstanding Achievement. Adam, he blogs at the Technology Liberty Front. And finally, we have Brian Walsh. I'm grateful to have Brian here. He's the Executive Director of the American Religious Freedom Program at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, a think tank here in DC. The American Religious Freedom Program is devoted to protecting and strengthening Americans' God-given and constitutional religious freedoms. The program's objectives include reversing the efforts to marginalize and delegitimize religious expression in public life and eliminating government-sponsored intrusion on Americans' attempts to live out their faith beyond the walls of their churches, synagogues, and other houses of worship. Before joining the Ethics and Public Policy Center, Brian was Senior Legal Research Fellow in former Attorney General Edwin Meese's Center for Legal and Judicial Studies at the Heritage Foundation. Brian and the Heritage were at the forefront of diverse, nonpartisan coalition of individuals and organizations fighting the abuse of criminal law and criminal process, especially at the federal level. Brian has testified before committees in the House and the Senate, and before the White House Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. And he appears frequently on television and radio, and his commentary has been published by numerous traditional and new media publications. So thank you, Brian, for being here also. I'm going to hand it over to Craig for our panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. I should mention, before coming to NRB, Aaron is currently our Vice President of Government Relations and does a superb job through our Washington, D.C. office. But he was also on staff with Senator Sam Brownback in his office. And also after that, he was someone who did special projects with the National Association of Evangelicals. Now, Aaron, after our panel discussion, I'm going to step aside, and Aaron is going to take your questions. We're going to give priority to press, and he'll explain that to you, and he'll field those questions and direct them to our panelists at the end of our panel discussion today. I'm going to start, first of all, I'm going to pick on you, Colby, because we need to set the stage from a legal standpoint, define the territory, define the terrain that we're operating on, and resolving the questions of the conflict between free speech values for citizens on new media platforms and the free enterprise rights of those companies that have created those platforms. Now, first of all, you and I both know as lawyers that there are only a handful of cases that have actually dealt with this issue. 2 or 3, I think, to my recollection. The question of whether or not Google, Facebook, Apple, and these other new media companies are bound by the constraints of the First Amendment. And so far, those cases, I think we can agree, have all said, no, they are not so constrained by the First Amendment. How does that rule operate in real life? What is the formula for what entity is controlled by the First Amendment and what entities are not?
Great question, Greg. Thanks, and thanks very much for having this panel today. I would just give a quick introduction to say that whenever you try to touch on the free enterprise system and sort of suggest to them that they should operate in a manner that's consistent with the way they want government to treat them, you wouldn't necessarily think it's particularly controversial. You find out that the Googles of the world and the big players like Apple are very, very jealous to guard their rights, their full rights under the First Amendment. And yet it seems, sadly so, that all too willingly, they sort of retreat to this idea, but we want to treat, because we're private, those that use our facilities with a lesser standard than we ourselves would like to be treated with. Now that brings us to the heart of the question Craig just asked. Why is it, who does this First Amendment apply to? And of course, the language of the First Amendment makes it very clear. It says, Congress shall make no law abridging free speech or the free press, etc. And so it means that state actors, those that operate with the color of the authority of Caesar, if you will, at whatever level that may be, are the ones that are generally confined and constricted by not only the First Amendment, but essentially all of the Bill of Rights and, frankly, the Constitution generally as it applies. The only exception I can think of would be like the 13th Amendment, which also impacts private behavior at the outset. Of course, the conscript against slavery and the like. So unless you are a state actor or you are acting on behalf of the state, you're not otherwise subject to the limitations that the First Amendment would otherwise put upon you. And what are those limitations? When it comes to being a government actor, the limitation is that you should create a forum or an opportunity to speak that is content neutral, and that once you do so, you would then not engage in what's called the viewpoint form of discrimination. So what are we talking about when we say something is a forum or a content place that you can communicate? It's generally in the context of something the government creates. So you may have, as was the case in Finley versus the National Endowment for the Arts, a circumstance in which the government wants to spend money and create a forum to be able to talk about art, to talk about culture, to talk about a respect for those things that are wholesome and good about the American experience. That creates a forum in which theoretically government will allow you to speak. And then once you are creating this forum, the question becomes, what can I say in that forum? Well, here we've got a circumstance in which under the Findley case, you only can say things that are good and wholesome and proper about culture and art and this sort of thing. So when a young performer wanted to be able to express her angst about many things, including female sexuality and the role of government limiting these sorts of things, and dance naked and whatever, she would not be qualified to speak in that particular forum because otherwise you're not advancing the content, the very purpose of the forum that the government wanted to create for. So here, what we try to do in this larger context is simply allow rules of the road by which parties can engage in an open debate in a forum that meets a particular end or a particular purpose. In the context of the apples and whatever, it doesn't necessarily follow that they are that they're going to be in that same sort of context of creating a forum in which you communicate, but rather are simply providing the means by which you communicate. And so we get into this: are you now acting on behalf of the state when you create this means, or not acting on behalf of the state means? It's a little complicated, but that's essentially the sort of trade-off. Are you a state? Are you a state actor? If so, you're subject to these restrictions. If you're not, then you're not going to be subject to these restrictions, and that's where Apple and Google and all those cases have been.
Thank you, Colby. I wanted to set that stage. That was actually going to be one of my questions, but I thought it would be a great primer, because that really is going to presuppose then a number of other things that we're going to discuss. Now, at this point, with the ground rules having been set, and I don't think there's a lot of controversy about what Colby May just said, I'm going to give the other panelists a couple minutes to make some opening comments, either in response to our free speech charter, response to where we're at in terms of the First Amendment, or in context of the bigger issue about the conflict between free speech on new media platforms and free enterprise. So let me start with Stephen Waldman, first of all. Stephen, from your perspective, help frame this, and of course you come from a background as a journalist, someone who's not only a journalist from a traditional standpoint, but somebody who's intensively involved in online journalism, having founded BeliefNet. And now, of course, in one of the great bastions of journalism schools. So from your perspective, give us some of your thoughts on where you think the lines can be drawn and how you define this issue.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. First, I just wanted to say that I'm very glad that you're doing this. It's an important topic. These are the power and influence that these companies have is really enormous, and relatively little attention has been given to how they make their decisions about what applications, what content they promote. So it's really a crucial set of questions. On a personal level, I certainly agree. I was disheartened with what happened with the Manhattan Declaration app and some of the other examples that you gave. I had some personal experience with this, not that we ever got to be quite as big as Facebook or Apple, but BeliefNet routinely would have situations where we would be faced with, well, on the one hand, we have this general pledge to be open and respectful of all sorts of viewpoints. We routinely published articles that I found completely repulsive and disagreeable. We did all the time. We viewed that as part of our commitment to a free exchange of religious ideas. But it does cause consequences for a private company. We felt the effects of that. So I am also sensitive to running a private company and the needs that you are having to attend to. The fact that these are private companies is both obvious but worth pausing on for a second. They are not state actors, they are private companies. We would not sit here and say that Christian bookstores should be required in the spirit of diverse opinion to carry The Joy of Gay Sex in their bookshelves or Dan Savage. We would not say that talk radio should be required to have gay rights activists on their broadcasts. We would not actually say that even Fox News cable network would be required to have Muslim advocates to respond to anti-Muslim commentators. We've accepted in most of these cases that as private entities that there's a difference between free speech and opposing censorship by the government and saying that a private entity has an obligation to provide the other side of the story. It almost sounds like the fairness doctrine, and I know you're not suggesting a fairness doctrine for the internet. So really it comes down to, in most cases, a private company, just as a printing press has no obligation to print every book that comes to the printing press, a platform, an internet platform, has no obligation to publish every kind of viewpoint. It's perfectly within their role. So the key point, I think, embedded in this, the key question is, have these particular institutions become so powerful that they are, as you wrote, akin to the phone company? So powerful that they're akin to the phone company, at which point they start to become in a different realm. They become more like a utility, and that does change the nature of the conversation. I think there's more fine distinctions to be made between the different media companies that you have. You're talking about Apple and Google and the ISPs as kind of all being the same. I don't think they are. I mean, Apple, for all its market clout, has 15% of the U.S. mobile market. I would say that probably Clear Channel had, at least that much dominance on talk radio as Apple does. I think that the key is the ISPs, that the question where the religious liberty questions and free speech questions in general are most acute has to do with behavior of ISPs, particularly in areas where ISPs have very strong monopoly power. So it's one thing for Apple's very big, it's very important, it has a certain percentage of the mobile market, 15%, whatever. It's another thing when you're in a community and a particular cable company or a particular phone company has 60, 70, 80% of the market for access to the internet. That really is controlling the access points to the internet. So I would, focus there. And, I guess the only other thing I would say in reading through some of this is that I was struck about some of the ironies here, which is that, for instance, analogizing these companies to being like the phone company was the argument that was made by the left during the open internet proceedings and was opposed by Republicans and conservatives as being, an untenable approach. But I did come away thinking, that actually religious conservatives ought to be among the strongest allies of this current chairman of the FCC and his approach to open internet. Religious conservatives ought to be among the strongest voices in questioning mergers of the sort that we saw with Comcast and NBC, where a content creator is also a pipe holder. I jokingly said to a conservative friend of mine at the time of the Comcast merger, "So you're cool with MSNBC controlling the internet?" The fact that a content company has enormous access to controlling the pipes of the internet ought to be of concern to people who follow religious liberty. So I think that after the election is all over and everyone stops in Washington sort of playing this as a team sport, that there may be some prospects for some interesting alliances across ideological grounds on some of these issues if people are open-minded to good public policy.
Thank you, Steve. Adam Thier, I'm going to go to you next.
Well, thanks first for having me here today. It's a real honor. And I have to say, though, I'm a little bit confused because when I first got the email from Craig Harshel to be here at the National Press Club, I thought, finally, a book signing. I can bring my books. Confused. No, look, Steve Waldman, my friend, has stolen a lot of my thunder here today because I think he's got it generally right. I mean, basically, there's nothing new under the sun in some ways because the debate about the role of media institutions as gatekeepers versus their editorial discretion is a timeless one. It goes back many, many decades, many centuries, in fact. And I want to put the good news spin on this, sort of an optimistic spin, which is that we have never lived in a moment in human civilization where there have been more outlets for speech and expression. And this is worth celebrating. Because there was a time when there were debates exactly like this going on about newspapers and broadcasters, and your choices were really far more limited if you were trying to get out not just religious speech, but many other types of speech, right? When I first came to town in the early 90s, the very first debate I covered was fairness doctrine issues for the Heritage Foundation. And there were actually many conservatives at the time I was sort of fighting against, actually, ironically, like Senator Trent Lott, who were saying, we never get a fair shake from the media, so we need the fairness doctrine. And people forget there were a lot of conservatives who favored the doctrine during the post-war period when it was in effect, precisely because of that fact. But then we realized, no, the better option, the better alternative was more platforms, more diversity. And guess what? We got it. It's an amazing time to be alive in this sense. And so the best first answer to these problems about if you have a gatekeeper fear is, do you have an outlet or an option? And so I think we can all agree that there are horror stories. The Manhattan Declaration is a prime example. That is really troubling. But here's the good news. On your iPhone, you can open your browser and you can go find the Manhattan Declaration, right? You can go to a lot of other places and probably find it. Maybe that wouldn't have been so 20, 30 years ago. And so again, first best option is choice and escape, finding other avenues and alternatives. Because we know from what Colby said, the First Amendment makes pretty clear you can't impose the same First Amendment standard that we have for the state on private actors, unless you consider them common carriers or state actors in their own right. And they're just not. I mean, most of these companies we're talking about did not even exist 10, 20 years ago. Facebook, Apple, well, they did exist 20 years ago, but Google didn't. MySpace didn't. So the good news is we have continuous change and churn. And it's good to put pressure on, and I think the NRB principles in this charter are excellent. This is where we should start in terms of the pressure we put on private intermediaries for what their speech policies should be. That being said, I think I'd like to make an argument in favor of letting 1,000 flowers bloom. I'd like to make an argument that we should not necessarily want one single speech standard for all platforms, that there's something to be said for editorial discretion. Even when, and yes, I'm going to say this, even when it potentially discriminates against certain religious viewpoints. Yes, you heard that right, because what is editorial discretion except for the right to discriminate against viewpoints, right? There are certain things that newspapers don't want to run, or magazines, or newsletters, or BeliefNet. You have that freedom under the First Amendment. It doesn't make it a good policy, but I don't think it should be illegal either. And so if you flip this around and say, as Stephen already gave an example, if someone would try to force you to say, I want you to carry something that's pro-gay marriage or pro-abortion, say that's outrageous. No, we would never want that. So again, choice is the better option there, and I think we do have these choices today. I think the NRB's statement here is a really solid one, and I think here's the irony of it. I think a lot of these private internet intermediaries are going to like it. They're going to like it because all the pressure they're getting today is to do the exact opposite. It's to regulate or self-censor more. Ironically enough, I was here in this room this morning moderating an event for the Family Online Safety Institute right there. And we were discussing what steps should be taken by private companies to do more about cyberbullying, to do more about online safety concerns, to do more about violent content or whatever else. And here I'm holding in my hand, you won't be able to see it, but it's the Facebook reporting guide for all the different types of complaints they get. And the vast majority of these are things that people want taken down. Every single day, Facebook is bombarded with a litany of complaints about take speech down, right? So it's a balancing act that Facebook and Apple and MySpace and Google and Microsoft it's always this balancing act. They're trying to make a diverse constituency of interests happy, and they have to come up with policies that aren't always going to be perfect. But we have to allow them to have that experiment. I like the NRV's principles because that's the good baseline we should start the discussion from. But I don't necessarily think we can say, well, you have to have always pure free speech across the board. They're going to make some concessions, sometimes to tailor to their own unique audiences. And the question is, when do they rise to the point of being such a diverse platform, or what some academics call now a social utility instead of a public utility, that the rules of the road should change? Now that's an interesting question, but I think there's a whole other discussion we could have about the downsides of treating speech platforms like public utilities. There could be some serious trade-offs there. But it is a good discussion, because something like Google, with its search engine, has a lot, it's a powerful medium of expression that we all use and we count on being, generally speaking, fair and objective. So, you can see an argument being made. If Google tailored it so that you couldn't say or do certain things, a lot of people would have a problem with that. So, but generally speaking, I think the good news here is that there's not as much bad news. And I certainly, Craig, the only thing I'd be concerned about in your report is when you open with the statement that we're nearing a crisis point. I don't see that. I don't think we are nearing a crisis point. I think we have incidents. We have incidents we need to talk about. We need to put pressure on companies. But a crisis point, from the anecdotes I see in the report, I can't draw that same conclusion.
Ryan, you're next.
Good. Well, thank you. Thanks, Craig and Dr. Wright, and also Aaron for having me here today. It's an honor to be in this panel with these distinguished panelists, so I'm glad to be here and discuss this issue. I would say that I'll echo what Adam just said, that previous panelists have stolen a lot of my thunder, because I think I'm on the same page, especially when it comes down to the legal analysis. And so in many ways, I think that as I think about these issues, it's important to distinguish between the legal analysis on the one hand, legal/constitutional, and then the policy, the moral issues that are at stake here as well. And part of that turns or hinges, I think, on the issue that has been raised, which is what type of market share do we have, and also do we consider these to be platforms, or are they content providers? Because I think the standards for a content provider are much different than they are for a platform. Not that I'm saying that it's a legal standard. So when I think about what we're addressing right now, I am concerned because of the way that these companies are approaching these issues. And I think I'm concerned mostly on the social and the policy, and also on the moral issues. The first is that I think that their example of censoring, and I think that in many ways that these are platforms, their censorship that they've engaged in sets a horrific international precedent. And that is that it sends a message to those across the globe that American corporations think it's okay to censor on certain issues, on certain moral issues. And that's not a good thing, because as many people know, and as about 90% of Americans still believe, America sets the standard for what freedom looks like on issues of free expression and on religious free exercise. So when you get to that issue, when we have that type of mentality,